It was a quiet afternoon in a small suburban town. The streets were bustling with life, with kids playing outside, couples enjoying coffee in local cafes, and elderly individuals strolling down the sidewalks. Among them was a 90-year-old war veteran, Mr. James Carter, a man who had served his country with valor and had seen the world change drastically over the decades. Dressed in a crisp brown suit, his demeanor was calm and composed, reflecting years of wisdom and experience. His routine was simple, a daily walk to clear his mind and keep his aging body active. As James walked down the quiet alleyway, the sound of roaring motorcycle engines broke the serene atmosphere. A gang of bikers, clad in leather jackets with patches of their crew insignia, sped down the street, their loud laughter echoing through the alley. They parked their bikes near the old man, their boisterous chatter suggesting that they were up to no good. The leader of the group, a heavily built man with tattoos covering his muscular arms, stepped forward. His name was Rick, notorious in the town for causing trouble. Rick's eyes locked onto the elderly man, who continued to walk unbothered, seemingly unaware of the biker's intimidating presence. "Hey, old man," Rick shouted, his voice rough and mocking. James paused but didn't turn around immediately. He had dealt with men like Rick before, loud, arrogant, and full of misplaced pride. With a deep breath, he turned to face the group, his calm yet piercing gaze meeting Rick's smug expression. Rick walked closer, his heavy boots echoing against the alley walls. "What's a fragile guy like you doing out here? Shouldn't you be sitting in a rocking chair or something?" The gang burst into laughter, clearly enjoying the spectacle. James simply smiled, a knowing look crossing his face. "Just taking a walk, son? Why? Is the sidewalk off limits for an old man like me?" The subtle challenge in James' tone irritated Rick. He didn't expect the elderly man to talk back, especially not with such composure. Feeling his ego bruised, Rick grabbed James by the collar, pulling him close. "Listen here, old man," Rick growled, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't talk to me like that. Do you even know who you're messing with?" James, still calm, looked Rick directly in the eyes. Despite the physical intimidation, there was no fear in his gaze. "Do you know who you're messing with, son?" he replied, his voice steady and firm. The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter subsiding as they noticed the quiet strength in the old man's demeanor. Rick, however, was too enraged to back down. He shoved James back slightly, his muscles tensed as if ready to escalate the situation further. The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter subsiding as they noticed the quiet strength in the old man's demeanor. Rick, however, was too enraged to back down. He shoved James back slightly, his muscles tensed as if ready to escalate the situation further. Before Rick could act, James raised his hand, gesturing for him to pause. "Let me give you some advice," James said, his tone now carrying the authority of someone who had seen and survived far worse situations. "You may think you're tough, but there's always someone tougher. You don't want to find out the hard way." Rick sneered, dismissing the warning as the ramblings of an old man. "What are you gonna do? Call your grandkids to save you?" he mocked, his gang laughing once more. Unbeknownst to Rick and his crew, James Carter was no ordinary elderly man. He had been a decorated soldier during his youth, a man who had fought in the toughest battles and emerged victorious. But what Rick didn't know was that James' son, Michael Carter, was a highly trained Special Forces operative, a man whose reputation alone could send shivers down anyone's spine. As the tension in the alleyway grew, James remained calm, his mind calculating the situation. He knew there was no need for violence, but if it came to that, he wasn't as defenseless as Rick assumed. Years of military training had instilled in him the skills to handle such confrontations. Meanwhile, a passerby who had witnessed the escalating scene discreetly made a call. "You need to get here now," the caller whispered, their voice urgent. "It's your dad and some bikers. It doesn't look good." The call was made to none other than Michael Carter, who was only a few miles away, unaware that his father was in trouble. But as soon as he heard the news, he jumped into action, his military instincts kicking in. Back in the alley, Rick was still holding James by the collar, his frustration boiling over. "I'm done playing games with you, old man," he shouted, The bikers began to circle around, their presence adding to the intimidation. But James stood his ground, a subtle smirk forming on his face. He had a feeling things were about to take a turn. The tension in the alley had reached its peak. The gang of bikers encircled James Carter, their grins widening as they anticipated an easy moment of dominance over the seemingly frail old man. Rick, still clutching James by the collar, was seething with arrogance. "Let's see how tough you really are, Grandpa," Rick sneered. James, unfazed by the situation, kept his composure. His calmness only infuriated Rick further. The other bikers jeered, their laughter echoing off the graffiti-covered walls. It seemed like the situation was about to take a dark turn when the sound of a car screeching to a halt pierced through the noise. All heads turned toward the street. A sleek black SUV had come to an abrupt stop at the entrance of the alley. The driver's side door flung open, and out stepped Michael Carter. Clad in a simple yet commanding outfit, a black tactical jacket and combat boots, Michael exuded an air of authority that made even the most hardened men think twice. Michael's sharp eyes scanned the scene. He instantly recognized his father at the center of the commotion. Seeing the biker gripping his father's collar, a wave of controlled anger surged through him. His training as a Special Forces operative had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but nothing could suppress the primal instinct to protect his family. "Let him go," Michael's voice rang out, firm and unyielding. Rick turned to face the newcomer, his grip on James loosening slightly. He sized Michael up, noting his athletic build and confident stance. But Rick, blinded by his ego, dismissed the warning as just another bluff. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Rick shot back, his tone dripping with mockery. Michael took a step forward, his movements deliberate and measured. "I'm the son of the man you're about to regret touching," he replied coldly. The bikers exchanged glances, some of them suddenly less sure about their leader's bravado. There was something about Michael's presence that was unsettling, an unspoken intensity that hinted at the danger he posed. Rick, however, was not one to back down easily. He released James and squared up to Michael, trying to assert his dominance. "Oh, so you think you're some kind of tough guy?" Rick sneered, taking a step closer. James, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke. "Rick, I warned you." "You didn't listen," he said, his tone calm but filled with a subtle satisfaction. Michael's eyes flicked to his father, a small smile forming on his lips. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening for a moment. James nodded. "I'm fine, son. Just a little misunderstanding with these gentlemen," he replied, his words laced with sarcasm. Michael turned his attention back to Rick. "You've got two options," he said, his voice returning to its commanding tone. "Walk away now, and this ends peacefully." Or, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implied threat hung heavily in the air. Rick laughed, trying to mask his growing unease. "You think I'm scared of you?" he taunted, taking a swing at Michael. What happened next was a blur of precise, calculated movements. Before Rick's punch could land, Michael sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Rick's arm and twisting it in a fluid motion. Rick let out a grunt of pain as he was forced to his knees. The other bikers froze, stunned by the speed and efficiency of Michael's response. One of the bikers, a younger and less experienced member of the gang, decided to step in. "You messed with the wrong crew, buddy," he shouted, charging at Michael. Without missing a beat, Michael shifted his stance, using the younger biker's momentum against him. A swift, controlled maneuver sent the biker sprawling to the ground, clutching his ribs in pain. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. They had underestimated the situation, thinking they were dealing with an ordinary civilian. Michael's calm demeanor and lethal precision had exposed their bravado for what it truly was, empty posturing. Rick, still on his knees, looked up at Michael with a mix of fear and anger. Who are you?" he stammered, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Michael leaned in slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto Rick's. "I'm someone you never want to cross again," he said quietly, the weight of his words sinking in. The silence in the alley was deafening. Even the distant sounds of the town seemed to fade as everyone processed what had just happened. James, still standing off to the side, finally broke the tension with a chuckle. "Told you, son. There's always someone tougher," he said, addressing Rick. The bikers, now thoroughly intimidated, began to back away, muttering apologies and excuses. Rick, still nursing his wounded pride, managed to get to his feet. He glared at Michael one last time before turning to his crew. "Let's get out of here," he barked, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. As the gang mounted their bikes and sped away, the alley fell quiet once more. Michael turned to his father, a hint of concern replacing his earlier intensity. "Are you sure you're okay, Dad?" he asked. James smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm fine, Michael. You didn't have to come, but I'm glad you did," he said. Michael shook his head. "You're my dad. I'll always show up when you need me," he replied, his voice filled with genuine affection. James looked at his son, pride evident in his eyes. "Well, they certainly won't forget this encounter anytime soon," he said with a chuckle. Michael nodded. "Neither will I." As the sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, the alleyway returned to its calm, quiet state. Michael stood beside his father, taking a moment to ensure everything was truly settled. James adjusted his suit jacket and dusted himself off as if nothing unusual had happened. His steady demeanor belied the gravity of what had just transpired. Michael glanced around the alley, his sharp instincts ensuring no threat lingered. Satisfied that the bikers had truly retreated, he turned back to his father. "You've got to stop walking down alleyways like this, Dad. This isn't the 1940s anymore," he said with a small smile, attempting to inject some humor into the situation. James chuckled, his deep laugh resonating with warmth. "Son, trouble has a way of finding you no matter where you are. I've lived long enough to know that. But it's not about avoiding it. It's about how you handle it." Michael sighed, his father's words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I know you're tough, Dad, but you're not young anymore. You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said, his tone gentle but firm. James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression softening. "Michael, you've seen combat. You've faced things that most people can't even imagine. You know as well as I do that strength isn't just about muscle. It's about resolve, about standing your ground when it matters. That's what I was doing today." Michael nodded, understanding his father's perspective. As a special forces operative, he had learned to respect the strength of character just as much as physical ability. But seeing his father in danger had stirred a protective instinct that he couldn't ignore. The two men began to walk together, leaving the alley behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement as they made their way toward the park where James often enjoyed sitting on a bench, reflecting on life. "Those bikers didn't know who they were dealing with," James remarked with a smirk. Michael chuckled. "No, they didn't. But you've got to admit, you gave them a scare just by standing your ground. I'm impressed." James shook his head modestly. "It wasn't about scaring them. It was about teaching them a lesson. Respect is something you earn, and sometimes people need to be reminded of that." As they reached the park, James gestured toward a bench under a large oak tree. They sat down, and for a moment, silence enveloped them. Michael took a deep breath, appreciating the rare chance to sit and talk with his father. "You know, Dad, I never really asked you much about your time in the service," Michael said, breaking the silence. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift in the conversation. "You've had plenty of your own battles to worry about," he replied. "True," Michael admitted, "but I think it's about time I learned more about the man who taught me what it means to be brave." James smiled, his expression tinged with nostalgia. "Well, I suppose it's never too late to share a few stories," he said. For the next hour, James recounted tales of his time in the military, stories of camaraderie, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the heat of battle. Michael listened intently, his respect for his father deepening with every word. "You know, Dad, hearing all this makes me realize something," Michael said thoughtfully. "What's that?" James asked. "That everything I am, everything I've achieved, comes from you. Your values, your strength, your wisdom. You've always been my role model, even if I didn't say it enough," Michael admitted, his voice filled with emotion. James looked at his son, his eyes glistening with pride. You didn't need to say it, Michael. I've always known. And seeing the man you've become is all the proof I need that I did something right. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while, the bond between them stronger than ever. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Michael broke the silence. "Dad, promise me you'll call me next time something like this happens," he said with a wry smile. James laughed. "And miss the chance to see you swoop in like a superhero? Never." Michael shook his head, laughing along with his father. Despite the day's tension, they had found a way to turn the experience into a moment of connection and mutual respect. As they stood up and began walking back toward James' home, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. His father's unshakable resolve had reminded him of the values that had guided him through his own life. And for James, the day had reinforced his belief that no matter how much time passed, the bonds of family remained unbreakable. In the end, the incident with the bikers was more than just a confrontation. It was a reminder of the strength that came from standing together, of the power of respect, and of the unyielding legacy passed down from one generation to the next.